All right, good afternoon. Thank you all for coming. Welcome to this second in the series of presentation of our InterAgency Brown-Bag Lecture Series for academic year 2020. My name is Rod Cox. I'm with the Commanding General Staff College Foundation. And on behalf of our partners, the Commanding General Staff School, Colonel Scott Green and Mr. Marv Nichols, it's our pleasure to welcome you to this InterAgency Brown-Bag Series. The purpose of the series is to enhance your interagency education and awareness while you're here at the school. This lecture series is made possible through a couple of different grant sponsors, the Perot Foundation, and then our good partners here locally, the First Command folks, plenty of people here. You see them around the room. Let's see, we've got with us this morning Suzanne, Randy, and JJ. If you're interested in a free lunch at the next Brown Bag, see one of those folks, and they'll talk to you about how you can sign up for that for the next one we have coming up on 10 October, which will be with the Central Intelligence Agency. So 10 October, Thursday, 10 October, same time frame right here for the CIA for our next one. Got a couple things I want to bring to your attention publication-wise. The foundation is just published to also enhance your education. This edition of the InterAgency Journal is just out. This one focuses on papers from last year's ethics symposium. So you'll see some articles on ethics in there, as well as we just from the press today, our Foundation News Magazine, which is our Foundation's magazine that's been put out twice a year. And so we've got an addition to that. So you look for those. Those will be distributed out across the school here shortly. All right, today's presentation will be recorded for our distance learning states and our satellite schools, as well as the interagency practitioners via my website. So what that means to you here locally, if you're going to participate in the dialogue with a question with the speaker, please move up to one of the microphones on the tables. You don't need to do anything. The technicians will take care of that. You just start talking, and they'll activate and pick you up on the sound there. But if you happen to be one of the people around the room, back half of the room, just move up to a microphone to ask your question, please. And that way it'll be picked up for the outstations to be able to hear us. The topic of the domain of space and national security is quite timely. Those of you, I know there's some space students in here that Mr. Gray was telling me they're here. But for the rest of us, we obviously know this is one domain that we have to be able to operate in effectively in order to do our missions. There's a lot of talk about a new Space Force, new policies, new combatant command. Mr. Gray is going to talk to us a little bit about that. Colonel Tom Gray retired, United States Army retired, served as the U.S. Army serves as U.S. Army Space and Missile Command Defense's liaison to the Combined Arms Center and Army University. He has the responsibility for the integration of space knowledge and education across various TRADOC, joint, and other schools, which includes the Commanding General Staff College here at Fort Leavenworth. Mr. Gray was one of the very first officers designated as a Space Operations Officer. He served in the Army Space Command, at the Space and Missile Defense Lab, and is at the SMDC Directorate of Combat Development. He's qualified as a Level 3 space professional, the U.S. Army Civilian Space Cadre, and holds Space Operations Officer designation of 3 Yankee. He earned his U.S. Army Master Space Badge, and Mr. Gray holds a bachelor's degree from New Hampshire College and earned a master's from Central Michigan University. Please welcome Mr. Tom Gray.
Thank you, Rod. Appreciate it. How's everybody doing today? Everybody good? Thank you for being here. I appreciate this. And I thank you very much, Rod, for the good, kind words on the introduction. Makes me sound a whole heck of a lot smarter than I really am. I appreciate this opportunity to thank the Simon Center for including these opportunities for a little bit broader and knowledge in the interagencies and how it works with the Department of Defense, which kind of brings me to the fact that you ask, why is a Department of Defense guy talking interagency? Because I am a DOD person. I'm not one of the 3 letters that kind of runs around that is the focus of this. However, if you really get back to it, even though we're a department, the department also has a lot of requirements to integrate with all the agencies, and we all support and integrate together. So today, what I really want to talk about is the where we are as a Department of Defense, but also how and where that integrates from what we bring to the nation in our national requirements for our will and where we stand. And a lot of that has been coming forth, as was alluded to, by Rod, is in this thing called the Space Force. And what is that, and where is that, and what does that mean to us, both as a Department of Defense, but also, even more importantly, agency-wise, because when you think about it, who plays in space and how do they play in space, and how do we as a nation relate to that? How important is it to us in order to be able to put forth our national will? What are the strategic objectives? How does that impact our national sovereignty and our security? As was stated earlier, Rod noted that we have this, the advent of U.S. Space Command. And so today we sit forth and we are now integrated with a new geographic combatant commander, U.S. Space Command. And so I will address some of the issues that applies to us as a nation, as a department, but also how it interacts with the agencies. I think where I really want to start this is based upon why a U.S. Space Command, why all of a sudden this focus, and I'm going to take us back a little bit historically first and look at we as a nation and our sovereignty and how critical space is to us, especially when you start thinking about how dependent are we on a space-based capability, and do most of our citizenry even recognize that and understand that, which, I mean, just from the realm of telecommunications alone. I mean, if I want my MTV, how critical is that? I mean, how many folks watch the Emmys on Sunday night, and what happened? All the Games of Thrones, and how, you know, you don't get that without a space-based capability. And then how do we communicate across the globe? And if you have a diplomatic effort that's happening in some other country, if you watch what's happening in, you know, I don't know, Venezuela, the UN conference that just happened and is still going on, and the communications that needs to be done internationally to do that, and it all relies on a space backbone. If we look at the timing, the ability for somebody to just walk up, grab their credit card, say they want their Happy Meal, swipe that card, and all of that ones and zeros and the information that happens across for network timing, the ability for ones and zeros to traverse across millimeter microwave, across fiber optic, across wire, across space, and all of the timing that makes the networks work and even makes the communications work. And all that global finance timing is reliant on the US GPS system. And how critical is that to us as a nation to be able to ensure that kind of timing and that navigation, not just from a Department of Defense perspective for the employment of precision-guided munitions, but also how we can put together packages and information to happen at the right time, at the right place, through all of the agencies and the information. The deliverance of agency intelligence that comes through the comms channels, but is also geospatially located based upon understanding the environment. And that even then ties us to what about our own security here? And how critical is it to us as we address the issues facing us with Iran and facing us with North Korea and the threat of missile attack, and as we see the advent of how much money we have invested as this nation to protect us and the homeland territory through ground-based mid-course defense missile defense capabilities, and the ability to see that. But not only that from a overhead persistent infrared, but the ability to support things like wildfires and the ability to go in and protect us that way, looking at volcanoes, look at any major thermal events that happen and do that. And then the intelligence we need. I mean, going all the way back to, I don't know, early 60s and the Cuban Missile Crisis. And how do you know what's going on and find out what's happening? What is going on with the Iranian nuclear proliferation and the building of those facilities? What's going on up in the North Sea with Russian submarines? And what's really happening at the Spratly Islands? And if you do want to see what's going on with the Iranian nuclear chemical plant or nuclear plant, you can't do that with an aircraft. You'll get a picture once. And so the ability to have overhead presence through space is a huge accent to our national security and our national ability to put forth our will. And then, well, I don't know about anybody else, but just understanding the daily weather everywhere and what falls on weather. So all of these pieces that play, nuclear detonation detection and the ability to understand what's going on in the world presence and the world knowledge, the world communication, the world navigation, all happens through a space backbone. And then when you start thinking about your daily life, how critical is the environment of space just on the daily life here? I mean, how fast will the United States economy tank if we start losing timing and communications and the weather and all of that? So who's in charge of space? Who's protecting it? Who's taking care of that environment? What does that mean? Historically, we see the advent of the space age starting in 1957 with Russia. For the United States, it happens 3 months later in January of 1958. But I think probably the understanding historically, it's kind of say, okay, we got into space in January of 1958. And so we established NASA, and then you start seeing what can we do. The very first real use of space for us as a nation was actually missile warning, because we're worried about the Cuban Missile Crisis and what's happening with Khrushchev and all of the things that are happening in that Cold War period and the advent of that. We see our first weather satellite. You start seeing ears in space first, then eyes in space. When you start talking about 1962 and Gary Powers and that whole situation, and understanding that if they can reach up and touch, how are we going to be able to see what's going on, let alone know what's going on? And so with that, we see our communication satellite, and then our very first GPS satellite goes up in 1978. Just as a trivia thing, in case anybody wants to know, the whole science behind GPS and understanding how you can actually radio locate yourself from satellites in space all started with Sputnik. There were a couple of 27-year-old engineers working out at MIT, and they were listening to Sputnik go overhead, and all it does is go beep, 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 beep. And they figured out that they could understand how far away that satellite was by figuring out the Doppler shift of the signal. And they said, if I can figure out how far away I am from the satellite, I can start figuring out where I am on the Earth's surface. So it actually started all the way back with the very first satellite that went up. That's how GPS kind of came around. Understanding where the United States has its play diplomatically, legally, informationally, plays in the laws. And all this is based upon treaties. If you think about this, the United States went into space in 1958. It was only 11 years later we were on the moon. That's pretty fast. That's something to really think about, of the accomplishments that we can do as a nation when we really put our minds to it. And so what's that mean? So there are laws. They were finally codified 10 years later in 1967 from the very first Sputnik launch. And basically it says that open skies concept, freedom to use space. Who can go to space? Anybody can go to space. It runs a lot like international waters. They based the formulation of law for space off the maritime treaties and also thinking about the Antarctic. When Russia went up and they had an orbit going over the United States, you got to start thinking about, okay, what are the rules to this? Then the United States goes up 3 months later. How does that interact? Who has the right to do what? So you codify this and you say, okay, there is no airspace is sovereign, outer space is not. Littoral sector, 12 miles is legally sovereign. Everywhere else out in the water is not. So you just stand it on its head, and there you are. It does say that everybody has free access. It says it will be used for peaceful purposes. And I would tell you that everything we do is supposed to be for peaceful purposes, is it not? But if you can figure going all the way back to the turn into the 1900s and the development of aircraft. They flew across enemy lines, looked around, came back. Everything was free. Wave to each other as you go by on your each way. Next thing you know, somebody's coming up and shooting a pistol. Next thing you know, they're mounting machine guns. Next thing you know, they're dropping bombs. Air should be for peace. It was set up for peaceful purposes. No matter where man goes, you can expect conflict. And so with this, you look at space. Yes, it is for peaceful purposes. How do you maintain the peace? I can defend. I can put weapons in space. I just can't put a weapon of mass destruction in space. And so with that, we figure out that there are rules in space, and we as the United States have to play on that. This is one of the most subscribed treaties in the UN. There are 130 countries who are signatories to this treaty, even though there's only about 80 countries that have a satellite in space. But when you start thinking about that, for us, we codify this in our national strategy, our national security space strategy. And what is the strategy of how we want to play in space and what we want to do in space becomes pretty important. Understand, we believe that space ought to be stable, free, secure, and safe for our national sovereignty, because we recognize how important space is to us as a domain in order for us to be able to do what we do from a power perspective. Encourage the growth of commercial space, because we also understand money talks. Economic power rules. And the more we can be able to enjoin other people's money into our economy is power. And it helps us, and it allows us to do things. It is for peaceful purposes, and everyone has a right to use space, at least everyone who's responsible. And of course, then that becomes a kind of a legal minefield in itself of who's responsible and who isn't, who gets to say who can do what. So when you think about this, we as a nation, if we recognize that space is critical for our infrastructure, our power grids run on timing, our comms requirements for early warning, our intelligence to be able to know what's going on in the world, to see clearly, act with assurance, to be able to do business, we recognize space is important. But knowing that we're not the only ones in space, doing space, who else are using satellites to do their business? What are their motives? What are they trying to do? How are we integrated in that? And so when you look at currently about 80 countries who have satellites in space, of those, who are our friends, who are not? Who recognizes the dependence we have on the domain of space that we don't even, as a civilian populace, don't even recognize how dependent we are on space. We just turn on the phone. We just turn on the computer, turn on the TV, turn on the weatherman. We just do it without thinking about what are the pieces, parts that make all of that work, and how critical is the domain of space in what we do. And there's a lot of it. But how busy is it? And it's all about frequency management. You know, you see the government talking about giving away frequencies for more commercial proliferation. How many of those do we need, though, to be able to run the government? How many do we need to be able to communicate across the globe? And if we start giving all those away, what does that mean to our own security? Does that take away from DoD assets and requirements that we need? And then how much money plays in space? And what is the power? And when you see the growth of commercial space, just the economic ramifications of putting an astronaut to the International Space Station today I mean, we have an Army astronaut on the International Space Station right now. And it gets there by a Russian rocket because we can't even launch humans out of this country. And they charge a big penny for Vlad Uber. And so we see the economic power. We put sanctions on Russia, but we're giving them money to be able to bring our astronauts up there, and also to buy their rocket engines to put in our rockets to launch our military and intelligence sector satellites. That becomes an issue. We have to think about who plays and how much power gets to play in that. And then who is the threat? What can they do? And when will they do? If you start looking at what's current in the contemporary operating environment, what are the possibilities? If they're facing a major military conflict, one of the best ways to distract us is to cause issues here in our own home country, both through ones and zeros and through loss of satellite capabilities, loss of comms. When the home country starts getting hammered, then the engagement you're doing away ends up being suspect and having issues. And so we have to start thinking about how can they, what can they. We saw the advent of this in 2007 when China did a direct ascent anti-satellite and destroyed their own weather satellite. Now, there's nothing against the law with that. But if you're the PACOM commander, today Indo-PACOM commander, and you are watching China go up and shoot down and kill a satellite, what is the impact of that for us operationally and strategically? What's the message that's being sent and why? And so if you see the domain of space starting to be held hostage, then what will the impact be on our national sovereignty here? And at that time in 2007, you have to understand who's in charge, who's protecting that capability we have in order for us to do diplomacy, in order for us to put forth messages, in order for us to build an economy. Who's in charge of protecting that domain that is now obviously under threat? And there are different ways to threaten it, whether it's through electronic destruction of the electromagnetic spectrum, high altitude nuclear detonation over the country, and what would that do to all the comms links and all of the electronics, and understanding those kind of things that will happen, and who's protecting us from that. And so we see the advent of what's going on. What are the strategic implications? We had a US Space Comm for quite a while, but we have to understand who's in charge of the domain of space. And some would say NASA. Well, NASA's cool. It does the science and exploration of space, but they're not protecting it. And some would say the Air Force. Well, the Air Force has got a huge piece in space and got a huge piece down here and does a lot of that, but enough to cover the whole nation? Who's focused up there? Who's really got the real reporting piece? And so in 85 to 2002, we actually had a US Space Command. It's awesome. However, with the advent of 9/11, when we recognized who's protecting North America, who has the geographic responsibility for North America? No one. And so the Congress decided that we needed to be able to take care of that, so they said, and at the time, in 2000, late 90s, 2000, there really was not much competition to our security in space at that time. There was nobody there. So space really kind of took a drop in precedence. So they take the space mission, you hand it over to STRATCOM, along with Global Strike, Global ISR, Combating Weapons of Mass Destruction, Cyber, and they name about 8 different things that they had at that time. Said, here you go, STRATCOM, you're in charge of all of that, and we're going to stand up NORTHCOM. So STRATCOM gets the mission, but then you start looking at where in priority is it when he's in charge of the nuke forces and combating weapons of mass destruction at the time, and the cyber mission. And so we basically saw the space mission kind of attrit down to a very low priority. We're still doing business, still making it happen, but is anybody looking at how do we protect our capabilities for our national sovereignty? So, in 2018, everybody started hearing it, the Space Force. We're going to have the Space Force. And so when you looked at the security strategy, it says we need to defeat adversary space and counter space threats. If I've got China shooting down satellites, if I have them able to laser satellites, if they're killing the electromagnetic spectrum, how do I protect my United States? We want to maintain our commercial industry and extend our exploration, but we need to maintain our leadership, preeminence, and freedom of action in space. And freedom of action in space is really kind of the critical piece. What's that mean to us as a nation as we interact across the globe? And the way we interact across the globe is through our agencies. USAID, gathering intel, CIA, DIA, the ability for us to reaching out and touching FCC, FAA, and integrating those types of things. So National Space Council said, we need to put somebody in charge of the domain of space because it is contested, it is congested, and it is competitive. And whoever rules the high ground, really has the ability to maintain their sovereignty and their national security. And so with that, we've developed a Joint Space Development Agency. We've got to stop threats to security in space. And this is where we really first direct the creation of a legislative proposal for the Space Force, with the creation, making sure that they address it in the 2020 budget for Space Force creation. That's where it is. In 2019, in the NDAA, we see the Congress saying, we want you to establish U.S. Space Command again. U.S. Space Command as a subunified command of STRATCOM. And that was the proposal, 2019. This is how we're going to fund it. This is what we're going to do it. And all of these parts will come under that, and it'll be U.S. Space Command. Department of Defense said, we got it. And they said, we're going to go one step further. We're going to make its own combatant command. We will establish U.S. Space Command again, rather than subunified, because if it's subunified, you still don't have a full focus. We need the focus, and so they established U.S. Space Command. It was activated on August 29th. The ceremony was September 9th. General Raymond, who is dual-hatted and going to be the only dual-hatted, Air Force Space Command, U.S. Space Command, and the Army 3-star for SMDC, General Dickinson, is the deputy commander. So you see a very joint Army, Air Force, Navy kind of thing coming in here. So as this has stood up, General Raymond has said, this is how I'm going to organize. I'm going to have the Joint Task Force for Space Defense with the National Space Defense Center that has been working out at Schriever Air Force Base for the last 4 years. This is a very interesting organization. Their whole focus is on who's the threat, what's the threat, how are they trying to deny our capabilities in order to be able to do business in space. Included in there is a full joint look, but also some of our agencies are employed there. It is an interagency, that's why it's very purple. We also have some commercial companies there because of how reliant we are on a commercial backbone. This is where you start figuring out how do you warn folks when you've got threat maybe hitting your systems, and how do we plan for that, and what are the things we can do to defend ourselves. On the other side, we have the Combined Force Space Component Command. And so with this, you understand when it says combined, we also have multinational partners in this because we don't do this alone. And under that, you have things like the Joint Navigation Warfare Center. These are the folks who are interested in maintaining our capabilities in GPS for our timing, to be able to ensure all of the things work in ones and zeros, and all the things work in comms capabilities back and forth. The Overhead Persistent Infrared, the Missile Warning Center. the ability to be able to do missile warning, the integration of communications. And so we have the Space Operations Center out at Vandenberg Air Force Base, and we, the services, all services, play to support that as a Department of Defense. And so where we go today, this is the current draft of the National Defense Authorization Act that the House has forwarded into the Senate. It's being reviewed right now. So this is about as up to date as I could get. And so what you see is in Space Matters, the United States Space Corps. And so how it is currently being viewed is that we will establish a Space Corps subordinate into the Air Force, much like, think, Marine Corps with the Navy. You'll have the Space Corps with the Air Force. The Commandant of the Space Corps will report directly to the Secretary of the Air Force. They won't have their own secretary, they'll have an undersecretary. This four-star commander of the Space Corps will be a member of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and responsible to the SecAF. You're not seeing the integration as in back in 2018 where they said we're going to take the NRO, we're going to take the NGA, and we're going to take all of these forces, and we're going to take everything from the Army, we're going to take everything from the Navy, and we're going to take this installation, and that installation, this installation. It was really, former Secretary of the Air Force Wilson built this whole empire for space that was absolutely huge, and I think the ploy was if I ask for everything, they'll say forget the whole thing. They said, no, we'll just pare it down. This is what it is going to be. And so we will see the advent of the Space Corps and looking at that to be established beginning in 2021 and then fully operationally capable in 2023. Now, with all of that, you look at space, how much we rely on a stable, secure space operating environment. The ability for, let's talk about the federal communications systems. What are the links that we are able to, and the frequencies we're able to employ to be able to go up and down through the air, into space, and back down, and how does that impact us on the ground? Where are we able to do business in other countries? If I bring in the State Department and they have their ambassadorship and the attaché and the comms links that they need there, and how do we pull all that together? If you look at our intel agencies, how reliant are they on space, especially to areas where we do not have access? And this is how we can get access, because space is open for everybody. And if you've left the curtains open, I can look. And we have to understand what that means and how that plays. Federal Aviation Administration and the ability to even launch within our own borders, because you're starting to see the advent of launching happening in New Mexico, Wallops Island, Kodiak Island, Alaska, Cape Canaveral, Vandenberg Air Force Base, and now the spaceport that they're building in New Mexico, and what are the requirements when you're talking about launching, and how does that affect air traffic and what that means? And if you think about air traffic, there's a city over the United States at any time. There's always more than 60,000 people above the United States in aircraft. And so when you have stuff going up, you better know who's doing what, when, where, why, how. Talk about, USAID and the integration of, we just had this hurricane in the Bahamas. What are the space capabilities we need to do to be able to support that nation and bring forward? The ability to see where are ports we can use right now, looking at the damage that's happened. Can we get airfields? What is the current state? How do we rebuild? Where do we rebuild? How can we help them? And that all comes from a space-based capability, because we can bring that right now, figure out where do we bring fresh water, where do we bring hospital ships, how do we pull all that together. So every one of these agencies has some sort of space requirement, just as every human being in the United States is reliant on a space-based capability. And so ergo, though this may be a Department of Defense and I'm a representative of the Department of Defense, it is interagency, because it is the backbone of what we do for anything in the United States and how we integrate internationally. So with that, I would like to say, I think we do a lot from a space perspective, I think we as Department of Defense have to understand any place we go to do operations, it's not just Department of Defense. It's international, it's joint, it's interagency, and we have to understand if we are doing operations, what are the space capabilities we need to be able to prosecute that operation, and who are the forces and who are the agencies we're supporting, and how do we integrate that in the plan that we're doing, and how do we think about that, and what if the threat gets that and they have means to deny you? Have you figured out other ways to be able to do your operation knowing that the domain of space has limitations, it has weaknesses, and it is a vulnerable area domain that we integrate. So, pursuant to any sort of questions you might have, I thank you for attending this session of the InterAgency Brown-Bag, and I'm willing to entertain any questions you might have, but please remember to use the microphone. Yes, sir.
Sir, my name is Roderick O'Connor, and I've got a question. What elements of the UCP, the Unified Command Plan, do you think the reintroduction of the Space Force will affect or change the most? And additionally, with regards to establishments like the NRO?
Thanks, Roderick. That's a really good question. Because I have not had the opportunity to see the new draft UCP that is coming out, but I think a couple of things that are important is that the establishment of the U.S. Space Command in the UCP is a geographic combatant commander, which is really interesting because even legally, where space begin is undefined because where air ends is undefined. Unlike the littoral sector where I can measure 12 miles from the shore, you can't measure where air ends from the ground. I mean, if you go from Everest or you go from Death Valley, and then, oh, by the way, air is like fluid dynamics. You get a lot of pressure from the sun, it compresses on one side and extends out on the other side. But with that, they have recognized that the U.S. Space Commander has, as his geographic command, from 100K out. So even at 100K, there's probably the ability of an air craft of some sort to be able to go in that domain. And so he's responsible for that one. It is possible for a spacecraft to come down very low. Just gets a lot of drag. You end up having to do some push on it. So I think the major thing is that with this as a geographic domain, combatant commander, whereas U.S. Space Command used to be a functional, he was always in a supporting role. Now you're going to have supporting and supported commanders. What are the capabilities we're going to have to build in the ground forces who have geographic areas that it may have to be a supporting effort to the Space Command in order to be able to achieve the end state that the U.S. Space Commander is going to be looking for. With a UCP, this still does not establish a space service. The space service then comes under other titles. And that, so I'm going to extend the answer out saying that will be interesting because you will actually have a space service in your AO. So you've got an R4, a MAR4, AF4, and now a SPA4? I don't know. I don't know what it'll be yet. So that will be an interesting piece to find out how do you integrate those folks and what are they doing and how are they doing as part of that ground geographic combatant commander's AO. Did I answer your question? Okay. Wow. I really surprised myself. Yes, sir.
Sir Capmon, when you talk about the defense of national interests in space,
Yes.
when they look at the strategic approach for doing that, when they talk defense, are they looking more protective in nature, meaning preventing the destruction of our assets, or is it more of a retaliatory approach, meaning we can't stop you, but if you destroy our assets, we'll make it that much worse for you? It's
a really good question, and I appreciate it, and the answer is yes. I mean, it is. It is. Think about it in pick land, air, sea, pretty much the same sort of thing. Figure out how we can protect ourselves, make sure that we're actively defending, being proactively defending our assets and our capabilities, and making it harder for the threat to deny us. That's why we build stealth aircraft, that's why we build hypersonics and those kind of things. Make it harder for the threat to be able to deny us the capability to use the system. But then also, the best way to defend is to deter. And in order to deter, if you don't want somebody to do something, and show the capability to know that it's a lose-lose for everybody. I don't know if you want to say this is mutually assured destruction in space, but yeah, the ability to interact at any domain, I think is probably pretty much the same as we've done in anything else as humans. So the answer to that is yes. How do I protect my stuff, and how do I get better at that, but also how do I, if necessary, deny you the capability? And that's the whole mission of space control. Sure. So yeah, yes. Yes, ma'am.
Sarah Lindsay Snyder, you just talked about Russian deterrence. Is there any sort of plans that you know of actual deterrence towards commercial-based? So the ones that are putting up those microsatellites, is there any sort of strategy right now that the Space Force has to deter the overpollution of the geosynchronous?
Okay, so thank you for that question. I like that one too. These are all, stop making me work. I think the issue is I believe, in my belief is based upon our current treaties and laws. I got nothing. I don't. And so either A, that means we have to re-look at and reinvest in our law structure internationally, and don't hold your breath. The other thing is the more we can have commercial up there and doing business is probably the more secure our capabilities are. Because now you have multiple avenues, multiple rows to go. If something happens here, I still have another means. It's no secret. Operationally, during OIF, OEF, 86% of the SATCOM we used was commercial. And if you start getting countries denying commercial capabilities, the market plays. And then you have real issues. I think international and national dependence on commercial capability, A, it makes us a lot of money. B, I don't see us going up and fighting companies, but that doesn't necessarily mean you can't leverage economic capabilities in the marketplace to influence your strategic goals as a nation. Sir.
Carter Klimas here. What forces, what non-Space Corps forces do you see aligned under Space Command after 2023?
That's also a really good question. I can only prognosticate at this point because I have pretty much the same amount of information you have, but things that I've been seeing is that the military services will continue to maintain their professional space cadres. So you won't see every space professional come out of the Army, come out of the Navy, come out of the Marines, and move over and be part of the Space Corps. I believe you will see in the Air Force, though, pretty much 100% of all their space professionals they have now, what they're called 13 Sierras, some of their 63s and their acquisition folks who do space stuff. I'm pretty sure you're going to see all of them come out and go into the Space Corps. One of the first premonitions of this I got is when the Air Force said we are no longer sending any space folks to the Command and General Staff College, and we've had them here for decades, helping teach the space piece, and now they're saying no, we got other things to do. And so I think you'll see the Air Force will subsume all of their space capabilities into the Space Corps. You may see some parts of the Army Some pieces, parts of the Navy, very little, move over into that as well. Currently by this NDAA, when I looked at the NDAA, they were talking about nothing coming out of anything but Air Force Space Command. So I don't know yet. But with that, the service capabilities will definitely be integrated by service responsibilities because, for example, Army Space and Missile Defense Command is the service component to Space Command. So we're going to have they're going to have tasking authority to be able to say, I want you to do this, 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 to support Space Command in the space realm. So right now, I don't see a lot of, definitely nothing out of civil coming in because it's strictly Department of Defense. Some pieces, parts may be moving a little bit, but each of the services still must retain their and General Raymond said this. I heard him personally just 3 weeks ago, said, we need space professionals in the services because they understand how their services do business. And they integrate the stuff here. Space Force is going to be worried about that there. So I think that's kind of where that is. Okay. Thank you for the opportunity to be here. I appreciate this. I'll turn it back over to Mr. Cox. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tom. Next brown bag will be 10 October with the Central Intelligence Agency. Mr. Kevin Rousseau is in the audience here. We welcome you back then, 12:30 to 1:30. If you're interested in the free lunch program during the brown bag, see one of our first command sponsors. Thank you all very much. See you next time.